Hello, friends of the Austin Institute, and welcome to another episode of our show, What We Can't Not Talk About. This episode, I think, epitomizes for its content the reason why we even exist, and above all, the reason why we chose our name, What We Can't Not Talk About. And before I get into the context of the things that we're about to discuss today, I wanted to start by asking you this question. Do you, listeners, keep your opinions to yourself because you're afraid that people will reject you if you say what you think? Or do you, or did you ever sign on to a cause just because everyone around you acted like, well, that's the right thing. That's the only thing to do. So if the answer to one of these two questions, to both, is yes, then the author of The Weaponization of Loneliness and today's guest, Stella Morabito, has definitely something to tell you. Good morning, Stella, and welcome on our show.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much, Marianna. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you also, knowing, you're being invited by Fox News hosts. So I'm very glad that you accepted, our invitation on our modest, small show, but that I know has a lot of impact on a lot of lives of the people that follow us. So thank you. Thank you for your time. So as I said, our title, What We Cannot Talk About, cannot but signify that we agree with at least some of the things that you write, things that you make very clear at the end of your book, speaking of the importance of free speech. And also dealing, as we do here at the Institute, with students, and probably with the loneliest generations that existed on this planet. We could not but be attracted by your title, right? The Weaponization of Loneliness. And you speak of loneliness. So you speak of loneliness as a weapon in the hand of tyrants. Like the subtitle is like, how tyrants stoke our fear of isolation to silence, divide, and conquer. So of course, this is extremely attractive to us. And again, I largely agree with a lot of the things you say, and I really enjoyed reading your book. But before we dive deep into its content, I wanted to ask you, for those who do not know you, if you might want to introduce yourself, and especially, what makes you an expert on regimes and on totalitarianism.
Well, thank you so much, Marianna. I've always had a strong interest in things that deal with psychological manipulation. How people can be persuaded to do things that in their better judgment they wouldn't do. And this is something that's been with me since childhood. But then later on, I studied Russian and Soviet history in my graduate work. I got my bachelor's in journalism and international relations, but then I studied for a master's in Russian and Soviet history, and especially reading about Stalin's reign of terror. All of this interest in how isolation is used as a weapon really started to crystallize with me. And then with that degree, I ended up working at the Central Intelligence Agency as an analyst. And much of that work had to do with media analysis and propaganda of the Soviet Union. This was back, in the Cold War days. And that even more greatly influenced my focus on all of these issues of dealing with propaganda in our daily lives, and how it affects us and how it affects our personal relationships. And so anyhow, after about a decade there, I ended up home raising my children and homeschooling them, but I never lost an interest in that. And I started tracking how all of those mechanisms were involved in life in America. I started tracking the abortion issue and, all the life issues, eugenics, and of course, education and propaganda in all of our institutions, and what I called woke creep even in the military, even in churches. And I just became, really interested in that. And then I started writing about a lot of these things, first in the Washington Examiner, and now I'm a senior contributor and have been a senior contributor to The Federalist. Your listeners may be familiar with the magazine, online magazine, The Federalist, and since 2014. Anyway, a lot of my work there and a lot of my essays have to do with the social fallout of propaganda, of media, and manipulation, big media, big tech, and the cult mindset, mobs, and the mob mindset. So that's kind of a really long introduction, but that should get people familiar with my bio.
Yeah, and honestly, I do think that the people that are listening to us already know who you are. I wanted, I cared about, your work, your knowledge about how the Soviet regime worked and your knowledge of history, because I want to talk about history, and you do talk about history in your book.
Yes.
But so, every scholar would ask, what is your main thesis? When in writing this book, I would like to know, what is your main thesis, if there was like something that people would know, like approaching your book. And, a corollary of that question is like, why did you feel the need to write it? Why aren't your, Federalist articles like, or, why aren't the short articles enough? Like, why do we need a book and a description of the whole thing?
Oh my, thank you, Marianna. Yeah, I wrote this book because I felt I needed to put together some kind of a blueprint. It wasn't going to fit into an essay or an article, from start to finish, of all of these observations, because I didn't see it out there. And that tied together, what ties all of these totalitarian regimes together? What ties all of those impulses together? And this has been the question that I've been trying to probe for so much of my life. And I came up with a thesis that, I think we all know instinctively that as human beings, we are hardwired to connect with other people. Human beings are social animals. We cannot live in isolation. And therefore, the flip side of that need, that desire, is the absolute fear. I would call it a primal fear of being ostracized, of being cast out of society. That's enough. If you've read about a lot of societies and communities that are isolated themselves, when a person is cast out, they very often tend to just die in isolation. So it's a very traumatic thing for a human being, very abnormal. And so that fear of intense loneliness, intense isolation, is very easily exploited. It makes us so vulnerable to the tyrannical impulse in certain players out there that it's really what we need to get a handle on, to try to build counter strategies, because that fear can dictate so much of what happens in a society. And you see it in like the World Economic Forum, which is meeting this week in Davos. They talk a lot about just censorship, criminalizing speech under the guise of hate speech, but criminalizing conversation, really, is when you get right down to it, having us all live in some kind of a digital world, like the quote metaverse, instead of real life connections with other people, where we're all kind of isolated in these fake, three-dimensional scenarios, and that's supposed to be a substitute for real life. And so they want to control, what you eat and where you can go and your mobility and all of that. And this is all of a piece. All of this stuff is isolating by itself. And so I'm sorry. So put it in a nutshell, my thesis. The fear of isolation is what causes us to self-censor and obey and comply with the orders of totalitarians. And that, of course, only digs us deeper into isolation. That's the great irony. And we have to push back against that if we want freedom to survive.
Yeah, what is fascinating about you say, it pushes into further isolation is something I was telling, I was discussing with one of our undergraduates last night about this and how, we were talking about, she said, well, but people have friends. And, my answer was just like, yeah, but if you have friends with whom you don't, to whom you don't tell what you really think, you are farther isolated. You're still alone, right? Because they don't know exactly who you are and what you really think. And then the fear is, if only this person knew who I really am and what I really think, I would be rejected. But even if we don't, and we create this relationship based on appearances of what we and this leads to, I've already talked about it, but we did a short reading group on the essay by Pieper on the abuse of language, abuse of power, where he says, by lying, we destroy the possibility of a relationship. And lying is also, self-censorship is a way of lying, right? Because
exactly, absolutely. No, if you can't speak openly to other people, especially those that you come in contact with in daily life, whether it's, really bad if it's your family members or what you would call close friends, if you can't speak openly, you can't have relationships. You can't develop a relationship. And that is what is behind censorship, what's behind political censorship. It cuts off the potential for strong human bonds to develop. And so that's why it is so insidious, censorship in general.
And another thing that I wanted to point out, there is something very beautiful, I think, and very charitable in pointing out this fear of isolation, because somehow you save 80% of the people from the accusation of being, evil, or like why, when we look at history, it's like, why did these regimes make, why did people not react? Why did they get along with it? Why did they obey? Why didn't they, why didn't they stand up against evil? And so I found that, speaking of this fear, which of course we can't give into it, right? If we know that we have this fear, we need to react.
Right.
But somehow I found it very charitable, and therefore true, because usually to be charitable, but also to be truthful towards most people, right? And you also write, good people are usually not suspicious. That's another beautiful sentence that you had there, right? Like they tend to believe, good people tend to believe what they're told.
Yes. And again, that is exploited. Most famously, perhaps, in Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, where rule, I think it's 13, use the goodwill of others against them in order to push your agenda forward. And that's what's been happening. And yeah, it is a very natural fear, and we're all susceptible to it. Some of us have better thresholds for speaking out than others. And that in part depends upon our ability to fall back on strong relationships. If we don't have, and there's so much brokenness in family, so much brokenness in religion, so much brokenness in community. And I'm talking about organic community, not, the kind of community that, people left tend to, talk about all the time, which is kind of a demographic. I'm just talking about people coming together in a sense of friendship and community and goodwill. And because of all of that brokenness out there, first of all, most people are affected by that. And so they're a whole lot more vulnerable to being exploited than those who might have family and strong friendships. They can let their hair down and just say exactly what they feel, and they can have, they could feel good. And, after a hard day, dealing with all that censorship and speaking out and maybe being demonized for speaking out, but they know they've got those friends. They know they've got those those loyal bonds that they can fall back on. And unfortunately, I don't think most people today have a strong enough sense of loyal bonds. They're at a great disadvantage. So the second thing I'd point out is that turning this around is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long road back, or a hard road, if not a long road. There may not be that much time, but a hard road back. But we have to kind of help reignite bonds like that, reach out in community, and of course guard and protect the bonds that we already have, because there's so many things happening now that meddle in those bonds. For example, I was told that I don't know what state it was. There's probably more than one state where 12-year-olds can get vaccinated without parental, without any permission. And pediatricians are already throwing parents out of the out of the office so that they can talk to the children privately. And so there's that interference now in those bonds in many different ways. I mean, not just parent-child, but there's in California, I believe. I don't think it didn't go through, but there was a bill in the legislature trying to break the seal of confession, so that priests could would have to be forced to testify, so or the parishioner would be forced to testify. So all of these meddlings in relationships are very insidious. They bode ill. So we have to guard and guide them, and reach out.
Yeah, and as you say, it's going to take time and it requires formation, which you somehow it's, of course, it goes to the core of our mission, and educating people to these loyal bonds. And one thing that I would like to point out is that these loyal bonds are what they mean, to me at least, is that you don't like the person because of you agree on certain things. You don't have this bond with the person because you have the same political views, or you have the same faith, or because that speaks again of an identity and of like liking the person because of something she thinks or said or did that it's insufficient, I would argue, to overcome that fear of loneliness, right? Because in order to feel that we have bonds, as you said, it's like you need to come back one night and say maybe even something that you don't really think, like, but you're not constantly terrified that, your husband or whoever is there is going to say, well, then, if you said this, then I cannot talk to you anymore. Like, I thought you were a different, right? I thought you were a different person, but like now that I know this of you, somehow these loyal bonds are bonds that forgive us, that see us for beyond what we think in the moment, what we say in the moment. And so I think they are the opposite of identity politics. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, because they have to do with seeing one another as unique individuals, seeing one another as human beings who have different perspectives and different, thresholds, different, experiences that shape who they are. Absolutely. And that, identity politics is all about just seeing you as a piece of a group.
And I talk about identity politics because you do it extensively in your book, right? So you have one of the second section, I think, the vivisection of America, where you describe like how identity politics, and the focus on women, the focus on race, the focus on the differences as vivisected the country, like so divided and eliminated those bonds. One thing that you mentioned, sometimes I think people like us that have been, active in this word for a while forget that some of our listeners are completely unaware of a lot of the names we, name and the books we mention. And you mentioned in your book, you mentioned multiple times this Rules for Radicals. So would you say something more about that book and who wrote it? And
oh, sure. It's been a little while since I've read the whole thing cover to cover, but Saul Alinsky was a very far left radical who published during the 60s and even before, And he published this book, I believe, in 1971. What people find very interesting about it, the one snippet, is that he dedicated it to Lucifer, because he, quote, won his own kingdom, that's something we're all supposed to emulate. But it's really about what I would call the this sort of manipulation, the weaponization of loneliness, in order to push through these agenda items of radical transformation, really socialism. And socialism is really just having a little core of people dictating to all of society how they should live. That's what we see time and time again through all those utopian revolutions. But the Rules for Radicals book was meant to guide radicals. I guess, like Hillary Clinton was a big, I guess she even met Saul Alinsky, disciple of his. And it's just about, how do we take over the system? How do we, as radicals, leftists, turn this society into really collectivist one, rather than one that values the individual? They don't put it that way, but that's what it amounts to. And he adds guidelines, like Rule 1, Rule 2, and of course Rule 13, I think, was use their goodwill against them.
Yeah. And I mean, I know I was recommended reading it a few years ago. I haven't done that already, but because, it was a great example of how most of the rules have been followed by those in power. So for anyone, curious to dive deeper, you can find a copy in the library and see what this book is about. Another thing, you highlight in your book, and I really loved it, how utopianisms are characterized by the belief that men are perfectible, right? And so is the negation of the fact that no, we're not going to be perfect in this world, and this is a red flag that we usually have with students, is to, not to trust anyone that says, if you're going to change the system, human beings are going to be great, right? And instead, you need to work one-on-one. You need to change the persons, and then maybe the world will change, right? We need to focus on one by one, because there's no perfect condition for us to be again, to be, without the fall, without limits, without and so I grew up knowing that a good way to learn this is to look at history. And I wonder if this is the reason why you bring up this historical precedence of tyrannical regimes. So you mentioned Cromwell, Robespierre, Lenin, Hitler. Is this why you think history is important, and is it sufficient?
Well, whether or not it's sufficient is a different question. Important, absolutely critical, and that's why it's such a shame that history is not taught like it used to be. So these utopian revolutions that I discuss in the book are, I think, a way of showing the reader that there are very common patterns and very common goals that are shared by tyrannical regimes all through history. And we see them even today in the globalist push with the World Economic Forum and all of that, pushing for censorship and all of that. The things that have changed are pretty much threefold. First of all, with the utopian revolutions of the past, you don't have the technological advances that you have today with the internet and communications technologies, big tech and all of that. Second of all, they're not confined to a region like France or China or, North Korea or, Germany. They are, or Russia, they are global. They have a reach that's global. And thirdly, it's not like there's a dictator like that's common, that's running the whole show the way you saw a demagogue like Hitler or Lenin or Mao. What you have today is what I call like a hydra-headed beast. It's the corporate world, along with political elites, along with big media and big tech and all these institutions. It's hydra-headed, coming from like all these different directions. So those are the differences. However, the methods are pretty much the same. Involves coercion, involves, when you talk about perfectibility, it's not really perfectibility of man so much as trying to coerce man to fit into this mold. I mean, in the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Russia, they talked about the new Soviet man whose loyalty would only be to the state. And there was a deliberate, blatant war on family, pitting family members against one another. So this is very common. You see this all through all of these kinds of things. Demonization campaigns, again, very common through all of these utopian revolutions. In fact, I talk about what I call the machinery of loneliness that is employed to try to create this social control that all utopians try to control human beings. And the three main components of that machinery I discuss at length in that part 2 of the weaponization of loneliness. And they are identity politics, which divides us and is intended to divide us into classes of oppressors and victims and label us. Political correctness, which is meant to induce us to self-censor so that we shut up about what we believe and even lie about what we believe in order to be accepted or at least to avoid being ostracized. And thirdly, mob agitation. And it's the mob that enforces this self-censorship, that enforces these divisions. And the irony, of course, is that the mob is in itself a creature of political correctness and identity politics, but it's there to do the bidding of the elites, to push the agendas forward, and so those are the three main components. But you also have snitch culture, the criminalization of comedy, for example. Joke telling becomes like a crime, especially if the regime is the butt of the jokes. Demonization in particular, where people are induced to self-censor because they're fearful of a label or a slogan. And you can think probably of 100 of them. I mean, we don't want to be called a hater or a bigot or a conspiracy theorist or an election denier or a fascist or a semi-fascist, as President Biden referred to half of America back in August. Nobody wants to be called names. So that is one very, very effective component in that machinery of loneliness, so that machinery of inducing and triggering the conformity impulse through the fear of isolation.
Yeah, creating this pariahs. And it's fascinating how you bring the traits together. So one thing that I would challenge the audience is, those that disagree with us, if they're listening, is, if they really believe that they are for freedom, is okay, stop treating people as pariahs ever. Right. And accept them for whatever they think, have a dialogue with them, have a serious dialogue with them at all times. Be true to the sentence, agree to disagree, right? Which is often said, but very, very rarely practiced in regimes and in nowadays, if we see today's words as a regime. But there is one sentence at some point in your book, because we're so used to our life that, you made me remember, like, the president of the United States was deplatformed, which, one might agree or disagree with anything a politician says, but the possibility of taking the word away from the most powerful president of, like, the most important, the most powerful country in the world, that is the still think that's the case. It just speaks of the power that there is in creating, or in trying at least to create, this pariah, this isolation, this demonization of people. And one thing that I wanted to ask, for those who might be thinking, oh no, I'm way too smart and I'm way too honest, I'm not going to fall for the conformity impulse. I found it fascinating that you mentioned some experiments. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to, maybe mention one that might be interesting for, maybe the youngest in the crowd that are fascinated by the way our brain works and our behavior.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I, the first part, I talked about the history of this phenomenon of the weaponization of loneliness. And then, of course, I talk about the science. And when I talk about the science, I I'll just mention two experiments. First was Solomon Asch, who in the 1950s was trying to study social conformity. A lot of it had to do with in the wake of World War II and trying to understand how so many people would go along with the Nazis, or how so many people in Russia, in communist Russia, would go along with some of the, totalitarian, really brutal pushes there. And so as a result of these tyrannical regimes, Solomon Asch devised an experiment where I'm going to just explain it, for your listeners. If they're not familiar with it, it's really important. So he got about 9 or 10 people in a room. Only one was the subject. All the rest were collaborators with the experiment. And he had them match up. The task was very simple. They were told that the point of it was an exercise in visual judgment. So he has a line of a certain length on one card. And then on the other card, there's a choice of 3 lines of different lengths. The answer is pretty obvious which one matches the separate line. So for the first few trials, everybody gets the answer right. But then something starts to happen where all of the Confederates of the experiment, all the collaborators, pick the wrong line. Now, mind you, this is nothing political about this answer, nothing controversial. It's just the length of a line. But by the time they get to the subject who's seated maybe second to last or something, he hears everybody giving the incorrect answer. And so he thinks, my goodness, so what happens? About almost 40% of the time, the subject goes along with the incorrect answer consistently. And 75% of the time, the subject goes along at least once. So there's, it was just really fascinating. The experiment was replicated more than 1,000 times. Same thing, same results. So it's not just that he had to come up with the correct answer, but he had to do it publicly. And so one of the variations of the experiment should, be a bright light to a lot of us. In one variation, Solomon Asch had one of the Confederates of the experiment, one of the collaborators, give the correct answer while everybody else was giving a wrong answer. And the subject, instead of nearly 40% of the time, conformed only 5%. So that shows you the power of partnering, the power of standing up for somebody who's right when nobody else will stand up for them, because the subject would look to that person who gave the correct answer as a partner. And it had a huge effect on what Asch called puncturing the illusion of unanimity, that this was just an illusion. And the correct answer was a correct answer. It didn't matter what everybody else said. So having a partner is extremely important, and we need to take that to heart. Later on, Asch had a student whose name was Stanley Milgram, and maybe a lot of your listeners are familiar with him. And he was the one who did those famous shock experiments in the early 60s, where he had actors pretending to be, well, he had the subject had to give a shock for the wrong answer by the the person behind the screen. And what Milgram was trying to figure out was, are Americans susceptible to that kind of social pressure to hurt someone else, or to, quote, just follow orders, as the Germans were in World War II under the Nazi regime? And sadly, he found that, yes, they are. You can read about it in his book, Obedience to Authority. And if your listeners are really interested in this, I recommend a movie. It's very interesting that came out in 2015 called Experimenter, the Stanley Milgram story. And they can get more information. But I think what these experiments teach us is that, again, the weaponization of loneliness is very hardwired into us. We have that fear of being rejected if we give the wrong answer, if we give the right answer, or say what we believe. And then again, we also have this deep-seated kind of impulse to follow orders by authority figures, even if we know they hurt people. So yeah, Milgram found just an astounding number would go along with these shocks, to the very end. And I think it was something like 40, 50%. I don't remember the exact numbers. It's in my book. But
yeah, it is in your book. And I mean, I don't know that I could ever end this conversation, because everything you mentioned in your book is so great. But just about the things that you just mentioned, you brought up 2 points that you make extensively in the book, and I encourage everyone to buy it and to read it. One thing is we follow orders, and ultimately there will be an authority. So that's something you make clear in your book, that sort of like the consequence of that is just be aware of who's your authority, but there is gonna be one. We're not living in a world where no one is the authority. And then the other thing that you mentioned, you only need one person to speak for the subject to feel empowered. So if anyone has the courage or the circumstances or the freedom to speak, it's extremely important to do it, because it's gonna completely change things. And also, you point out, as every regime, that's the one thing they don't want, right? It only takes one dissenting voice to bring down the castle, right?
That's right. That's right.
House of Cards. Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's something that was brought up in Václav Havel's essay, "The Power of the Powerless," is just that, this is why regimes have the strong need to censor people, to shut them up, is because even one voice can create a cascade, an opinion cascade, if others agree with that. The idea is to keep those, if you have those beliefs, to shut up about it, to keep them private so that they don't affect other people. That's the idea behind a censorship regime.
Which is why, which is that this epitomizes, we titled our show "What We Can't Not Talk About," right? So regardless of who's going to decide what we have to think about something, whatever it is, right? We're just going to talk about things, and just talking and asking questions. Socratic, it goes back to the Socratic method, right? You're just asking questions, and then we'll see where we get. Like, we have dialogues, and for those interested in how much dialogue has to do with relationship, that can go into the Greek origin, the roots of the words, and understand what that means. But that's another big whole discussion on the importance of dialogue. I encourage everyone to read your book, to go deeper into the traits of those regimes. And, they can provide a lot of insight on the world we live and how things don't really change that much. But one thing that, even though I work with we work here with a lot of university students, I was not aware of, honestly, and it pretty shocked me, was your description of the privilege walks. Yeah. I don't know if everyone is familiar on our show with what they are.
Well, I don't know. If you're near campus, they may very well be. This was an idea to kind of create awareness. It started with, white privilege, but now there's walks for, quote, family privilege. Now,
Yeah.
think about what that means. I mean, that means that your peers, if you had, quote, some kind of privilege by growing up in an intact nuclear family, you are disadvantaging others. I mean, that's really where this whole idea is supposed to lead you if you didn't have those advantages. For example, with the walk, the exercise is that all the students line up, and then they'll say, for example, if you grew up in a household with two biological parents, take 2 steps forward. And if you didn't, take 2 steps backwards. And then they'll have things like, if you went on a family vacation, take a step forward. If you didn't take, or if there were books in your house, where all of these things, if you didn't have any debt to worry about, if if you had 2 cars, it goes on and on and on, to pretty much vilify the kind of middle class life of a family unit that is cohesive and with strong bonds, and so at the end of the walk, you'll have, if you cooperate with it, which I never would, but you would have students who are pretty much identified. Everybody sees them. Oh, you grew up with all that privilege. And then you have students who are way back there who are, basically being told, look at what they did to you. I mean, that's really, it's meant to sow hostility. It's not meant to bring about friendship. They would say, oh, but just build awareness. Now, another way of doing that is saying that if you get married and stay married and you have children and everything, boy, it's going to be so nice for them. But no, they don't look at it that way. The way the privilege walk elitists, race baiters in many cases, look at it is to create hostilities and divisions and really destroy friendship. It has all kinds of really bad ramifications.
Yeah, and the bad ramifications, you talk about them because you also I found it extremely important that you also talk about our psychology, right? And how, for instance, you mentioned some of the historical cases where it did happen, that the person, that was kidnapped or like told, you are the source of the problem, that ends up believing that story. So one of the problems is also that you don't only create division, you don't only create hostility, you start having people hating themselves. Hating who they are, hating the fact that they did come from an intact family, without recognizing that that's actually, I come from a broken family, and just like, please be happy about it, because like you would do me a wrong to not acknowledge that this is something very beautiful that happened to you, right? If you're treating it as something that didn't need to be that way. I want to touch on, again, inviting everyone to read you for a lot of insights. And, I don't agree with exactly everything you say, but that's exactly why we invite people on our podcast, right? Like, that's why we talk. We don't, as we said before, we don't create friendships or relationships or interactions only with the people that would be exactly like us, also because that would be ultimately extremely isolating. But you have a great constructive way to close your book. So this is not a pessimistic, this is the end. Like, you describe very vividly, like, how bad things are, but at the same time, you do give a way out. And you talk about the role of, something that I'm a big fan of, reading groups. So do you want to talk maybe more about how you see, like, the reaction, like how you think we should move forward?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I call that last chapter a wrench in the machinery of loneliness. And these are the different things that we can do to dismantle that very destructive machinery. And one of them just has to do with awareness and building awareness. And yes, I did bring up the idea of book clubs. I actually piloted a book club on these themes in a suburb of Washington a few years ago. And it was just really uh, a powerful experience for all of the members. We traded stories about how identity politics and political correctness and propaganda worked on us, the mob and all of that. And it helped, it was very cathartic for a lot of the members to talk about their personal experiences. Maybe a child came home from college and disowned them because of the environment, or whatever the propaganda was. And so we read a lot of books and selections from books that dealt with propaganda and cults and how these psychological manipulations, how this psychological warfare affects us. And so I think it's really important. I bring that idea up not only as a means of getting people more informed, through these kinds of discussion groups, because I think it'd be great if they popped up on this theme. Of course, I'm talking about a book club or a discussion group on the theme of different themes like that fall under the umbrella of the weaponization of loneliness, like propaganda, political correctness, and mobs, and all of that. And there's so much literature out there.
Yeah, and you do mention a lot of titles. I was amazed because you provide a list of things to read.
I do have a bibliography. The bibliography is not multimedia, but I do intend to put together a multimedia bibliography that would include movies that people can watch together and documentaries that deal with these themes, that make us more aware of how easily we can become manipulated, how vulnerable we are, and how we might be able to push back. So the other purpose that these discussion groups could serve is to be what are called parallel policies, parallel institutions in a way, where you have that, because all the institutions are so corrupt, it's not going to happen. This awareness is not going to happen through education. It's not, through the institution as it exists now, right? It's not going to happen through
You mean by the Department of Education, yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's not going to happen through the media. It's not going to happen, it's going to happen, through people getting together one-on-one. And my favorite quote for that is from Jacques Ellul's book, Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes. He has a very pithy sentence in there. Propaganda ends where simple dialogue begins. And just as you say, one-on-one conversations, developing relationships. No, obviously, you're not going to agree on everything. You don't agree with me on everything. I may not agree with you. I don't know what but the point is, friendship, is very strongly tied to freedom. All relationships that are personal, that are open in terms of conversation, are tied to freedom. That's why censorship, political censorship, is such an enemy of freedom. And so that's why I believe that that's one way out of it. And there are a lot of little ways that people can, speak up. I mean, you can talk about like maybe a really awful piece of artwork. Like there was one that just went up in Boston the other day, right? On Martin Luther King. I mean, it's totally faceless. I don't know if you saw at the Boston Commons. Oh, there's this huge sculpture that was unveiled for the Martin Luther King memorial in Boston. And it's supposed to be two arms hugging each other, but it looks almost obscene. There's no human face. It's your listeners, many of them may be familiar
may
with
probably,
it,
yeah.
but,
and you do mention bring beauty back, right?
Right, exactly. And if you see something that you don't like, just say something like, oh, that rubs me the wrong way. I mean, it doesn't have to be a big, long polemic.
Yeah.
But then somebody else might say, yeah, I know, I don't like that either. It's a matter of speaking up about, not just things like, beauty, but and standing up for a friend, or standing up just for anybody who's being viciously attacked by a mob, like in a town hall meeting or whatever. Just standing up for somebody who is unnecessarily being attacked, verbally, demonized,
or ignored,
really
right? Or ignored, because there's nothing like, as you say, we're afraid of loneliness. Stand up for those that are being, the cancel culture. Sometimes I think we equate it with like being attacked, but you're canceled where no one talks to you anymore, right? Like isolated and left.
Well, that's the idea. The idea is to put somebody in a state of isolation and thus have them serve as an example for the bystander, who will have nothing to do with that person because they're fearful of the same fate. You saw this during the struggle sessions in Mao's Cultural Revolution, where the Red Guards would just mob people, beat them up, and accuse them of being enemies of the people. And if you couldn't be a bystander, if you didn't participate in the beatings, you were considered an enemy yourself. We don't want it to get to that point, but that's a logical endpoint if we just keep shutting up. So stand up for, victims of mobbing, and, stand up for beauty, make a point if something you think in the public space is truly dehumanizing, say so. These are just little things that people can be doing. I have a longer list of them.
Yeah, you do. And one thing I really like is that you say, live as if you were free. And I think that's also something you got from
that was the Polish expression during the Soviet during communist era. You live as if you were free. And of course, you'll have a price.
And considering, Poland made it through, right? So we could say that lessons from Poland should be lessons that we take to heart. Again, I invite everyone to get your book, to read it.
Thank you.
To speak up, to revive beauty, to go to comedy show, don't cancel comedians.
Yes.
And also, like, I wanted to close with this. Like, I saw that you dedicated this book to your parents. And so, we're an institute for the family. I know you have kids. You've said you've homeschooled, care about the family. What would they think about this book?
Oh, my parents? Oh, I think they'd be very proud. My mother would be very proud, even though her politics throughout her life were very leftist. So, it's just kind of, I'm kind of curious what she would think. Although she did teach me all of the, the basics about, being a good person. So, I think that, but I dedicated the books to my parents because, first of all, they were the one, this is my first book, and they brought me into this world. But they also did instill in me the spirit of inquiring about all of these phenomena, about, why people act the way they do, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it gave me a lot of, I was very gratified that I was able to do that and dedicate it to them.
Well, Stella, I'm gratified and I'm grateful for your time with us. Thank you for having written this book. And, I hope you're going to write more. We're going to keep reading your essays as well. And thank you, thank you for being on our show. If you ever pass by Austin, you know that you can stop at Stamberg Hall and meet some of our students. Some of our people would be delighted to meet you in person. And thanks to everyone who listened. And as usual, if you enjoyed this episode, enjoyed the show, so recommend it to your friends, share it. Again, get the book. Thank you again, Stella.
Oh, thank you very much, Marianna. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode of our show, What We Can't Not Talk About. If you did like the episode, remember to share it among your friends. Do not forget to subscribe, and if you can, please donate to the Austin Institute. Your donations make it possible for us to continue to do this, but above all, they support our local programming and the important, if not crucial, research of our fellows. Thank you.